I'm Tim Swallow, Cincinnati World Cinema. Really glad to see and hear you. And I'm quite excited because between Nicholas Yoda and John Alberti, I think we're going to have a very exciting discussion, and also amplified by Joseph Kathman, who I will now turn it over to cover some tech ground rules and get things rolling. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tim. Well, first off, as he said, my name is Joseph, and I am the one of the head of the tech supervisor slash assistant programmer at the Garfield and CWC. Quick bit of mechanical stuff. The best way to contribute to the conversation, we would ask you to raise your hand, use the hand raise feature, which if you go to the bottom and see participants an icon and click on that, you should have the hand raise feature when that screen pops up. Alternatively, if you do not see that, you could go the old-fashioned way and raise your hand, and I will
analog.
Yeah, I will be keeping track of, so like if you do that, I'll see you and get you when we have a moment. Karen, are you able to see the hand raise feature on your phone? Oop, Karen, you there?
Yeah, just trying to work through it to unmute. So yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can find the hand raise feature.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, yes, as Tim said, this discussion will be led by Dr. John Alberti and Dr. K. Nicholas Yoda. Dr. Alberti is the English Department Chair and Head of Cinema Studies at Northern Kentucky University. And Dr. K. Nicholas Yoda, he is an adjunct professor of theology at Xavier University and the pastor slash head of staff at Presbyterian Ridge, or Pleasant Ridge Presbyterian Church. So without further ado, here is John and Nicholas.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion tonight. If you've seen Corpus Christi, I think there's just so many things to talk about. And we were talking a little bit about the movie last night. We thought we'd begin by featuring Nicholas, who's our first time guest expert here with Cincinnati World Cinema. So we're really excited to have him here. And last night, Nicholas, you started off our discussion with some interesting observations that you made in watching the movie and concerning the idea of the Eucharist. And so we thought we would start there. If you could sort of recap for everybody what you were talking about last night.
I'd be happy to. First, I'm probably more guest than expert, so we'll ground it there. And I do want to thank you for the invite and for your time this evening. One of the things that, for me personally, that really struck me in the film, and I think it has to be captured best in the very the title of Corpus Christi. Obviously, the Latin is the body of Christ, and the feast of Corpus Christi actually goes back to really the premier, in my opinion, the premier theologian of the Catholic Church, and that's Thomas Aquinas. And in Aquinas's theology, which you can access through his seminal work, Summa Theologia, he really begins to not just further and develop the theology of the Eucharist, but grounding it in the authenticity of not just the Eucharist, but the adoration of the Mass, the central sacrament within the Catholic faith. That the body broken, the bread broken, and the cup poured out is not symbolic at all, but in fact, as the word goes, transubstantiates. It literally, there is a transformation. And so in the 1200s, the Pope at the time basically solemnized this, and it became an official feast recognized by the Catholic Church. In fact, it's a national holiday in many countries, including Poland. And so I think we have to think about everything that runs from the themes, the theology, from that origin, from the origin of what is authentic, what is real, and what is not, because that seems to play. It's the ribbon of so many different layered narratives within the text, from Daniel to the priest, to parishioners of the church, to actually what were the not my story or your story, but what are the facts around this heinous accident that is a cancerous plague within this small village. And so you go from there, and then you have the places where Eucharist, as far as fellowship, pop up in the movie, whether it be very powerful scenes being filmed in the cafeteria setting of the juvenile detention center, the actual breaking of the host in the church, the gathering around meals, the hospitality shown by the widow of the man who perished in the accident. So I don't know, just there's quite a layered number of themes that we could run with that. But I think that's a long way to say that, something of that nature. How's that, John?
Yeah, I think that was great. And one of the things I found so interesting about that was that idea of authenticity and what's real in a movie that foregrounds that idea, because we have the character of Daniel, who is a transformational figure in this community. Very Christ-like way. He comes from outside the community, a stranger, and he forces a reckoning with the truth, or what people understand to be the truth, but he himself is an imposter. He himself is kind of getting at what's real through a masquerade, through pretending to be a priest. But that raises all sorts of questions about what that means to be a priest, and what it means to be, a real priest, and the distinction between appearance and reality. That's a big part of this movie as well, too, in terms of how the community is behaving towards each other, and then their deep-seated feelings and emotions and trauma, which goes to, you could take it as far as the really big questions about faith, or about even the existence of God, that the movie brings up. Because it's as you mentioned as well last night, Nicholas, and the tragedy, brings up that question of why would God let this happen? It's a crisis of faith for everybody in the community. This unspeakable tragedy occurs that seems to so violate, the idea of a just universe, or a loving God. It's the old, why do bad things happen to good people?
Absolutely.
And the community is, rather than really engage with that for understandable reasons, they've sort of deflected the drama of that question into blaming each other, into turning on each other. And the priest that Daniel replaces, who is quote unquote the real priest, has not really been helpful in helping them come to terms with that. So it's the fake priest who helps them get at what's real.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's, you hit it when you said appearances.
Hmm.
This is all about appearances. There's a veneer running through everyone's life individually and corporately. Um, Mark Twain once said that clothing does not make the man, but clothing has gotten many a man a good job.
Right.
And notice notice that Daniel's veneer changed as soon as he pulled out the uniform.
Yeah.
No one really questioned. He doesn't seem to know how to do the magic words of the Eucharist. He doesn't seem to know all the things he should have learned in seminary.
Right.
But my gosh, he's got the uniform.
That's
He's
right.
got the veneer. If anyone is familiar with for me it was a children's tale that my parents read to me. But the Emperor's New Clothes.
Right.
If you're familiar with that story, that at the very end, the Emperor, thinking that he's got new clothes, was walking down the street naked. And no one wants to say anything until out of the mouth of a child yells, "The Emperor has no clothes on."
Yeah.
So I think this is about tearing off the veneer and getting down to the naked truth, if you will.
Yeah. And you pointed out that the crucial scene in the movie where Daniel actually does then disrobe in the church.
Yeah.
Like he takes those garments off in front of the statue of the crucifixion, which of course is the naked Jesus. That Jesus is not covered in vestments, and he's not dressed. It's not the idea of he must know what he's talking about. He's wearing a tie.
Yeah.
It's Daniel himself becomes very sensitive to that, and it's a knowledge he brings. He kind of knows that authority is about, if you think about his experiences in the criminal justice system and the detention center, it's all about uniforms. The uniforms the guards wear, the uniforms the inmates wear, that designate who they are, or at least on the outward, to all outward appearances. And those opening scenes show how all of the young men at the detention center also are playing this elaborate game with the guards of sending them out of the room, and then they can beat up the other prisoner, and then it's also kabuki, and then they go back to pretending like nothing's going on, including the prisoner who was beaten. He also goes along with it. And I think we understand that the guards know what's going on as well, too. That the guards are sort of doing the don't ask, don't tell, that I know when they tell me I have to go to this other place, and I tell them behave themselves, I'm not surprised what's going to be going on. And
the same thing happens in the village. So, the question.
So Daniel's really hip to that. He has a lot of expertise in that.
It's part of it. One of the questions has to be asked about where does not the incarnation, but the incarceration come from within this narrative. The village is a jail unto itself.
Yeah. And many of the psychological idea of that would be interesting too. How many of the people in the movie are imprisoned?
Oh yeah.
Psychically and spiritually.
Oh yeah.
And Daniel himself is kind of looking for freedom, a kind of psychological and spiritual freedom that's not dependent on outward circumstance.
Well, that's what's so powerful about where he is fixing the motorcycle. To me, that's where we didn't touch on this last night, but I think the two scenes that are fundamental to his freedom are when he is dancing, smoking, and fixing that motorcycle.
Right.
And then, but again, it touches on the fragility of freedom, because when he's watching the barn burn down, I don't think he cared about the barn itself or anything inside it, but that motorcycle.
Yeah.
That motorcycle to me is his ticket out of that village.
Oh yeah. It's
You
a
know,
symbol of freedom.
it is, you know, to me, it's the motorcycle diaries, just waiting to be written in Poland.
It looks like we have a question here. If you guys want to jump in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. That was me. You know, along the lines of what you're talking about, Daniel seeking his own freedom. Cheryl and I were just talking about this the other day, that the way Daniel prays, he prays for the whole corporate group, but he always prays in the first person singular. So you know, he'll say, God, I have been greedy, or in the church, I am a killer. And it just seemed like so much of what he was doing as he's helping the people in the town work through their own grief and anger. He's always also talking about himself and kind of seeking his own redemption. Like when he's talking to them about the need to forgive and love, I think he's asking for that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's his own confession, no doubt.
Forgiveness for himself. Would you agree with that?
Ooh, what happened there?
Oh, it's I think it's a Wi-Fi connection thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks
John,
like
you've frozen for a second.
Yeah.
And we've probably
Oh,
frozen.
I'm sorry. Did you hear the rest of what I said? Or
I did not.
know.
Not the very end.
I was talking about how when he's helping the people in the town to learn how to forgive and love and kind of welcome back the widow into the community of Muslims. Did we freeze again?
We heard most of that.
Yeah, I heard most of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, about Daniel.
And Daniel is also seeking forgiveness for himself. And
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That was my final point. Yeah.
Joseph, did Anna have her hand up?
I was about to say, I think she did. Maybe so, maybe not.
Is she unmuted?
Looks like I can't even unmute her. Well, maybe we could keep going, and if I see that icon get unmuted, I'll let you know.
Well, John, I was just going to say I thought those scenes are really. Oh, does your dad have a?
Yeah, it looks like Mr. Kathman has a question.
Yeah, Mr. Kathman.
Yes, I just I thought the movie was really very interesting, and I'm really enthralled by all what's being said. I had a basic question though around what you guys think around the fact that his impersonating a priest in Poland, you know, as a Catholic in the United States, you know, that's inconceivable to me that could happen in the United States.
Mm.
Is it something in Poland that this could happen? And
Yeah.
and
But Joseph, do you want to give a little of the backstory of?
Yeah, sure. So this I was fortunate enough to see this film at the Palm Springs International Film Festival, and we had a Q&A afterwards with the director, writer, lead actor, and cinematographer. And the writer expanded on that a little bit and talked about how this film is based off of a phenomenon of people impersonating priests. He didn't necessarily specify a specific region for the overarching phenomenon, but he said that this story specifically was inspired by someone who impersonated a priest in Poland, and had that storyline in the community of there was a tragedy that this priest helped, or that this person helped them grieve and forgive, and move on through. And the thing that I was taken aback by was that once they found out that he was impersonating a priest, he was excommunicated from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church allowed the community to seek financial retribution for, yes. And everyone, there was one within the entire community, exactly one person requested that retribution. Everybody else, no one else did. So, yes.
Well, that's great. I mean, that helps understanding why he never anticipated getting caught.
Well, and Ron, the thing is, you have to think about this. It's so implausible that's what makes it that's what makes it plausible.
Yeah.
I mean, since we are being recorded, I will not give names nor details, but I had a high school friend at the age of 17 that impersonated a Secret Service agent and got within 20 feet of the then vice president. That is a true story.
Yeah.
If they see this, they will know who I'm talking about. But I mean, that's a 17-year-old.
Yeah. Well, if you remember Steven Spielberg's movie "Catch Me If You Can,"
yeah.
which was based on the true story of Frank Abagnale, and it's exactly what you said, Nicholas, that the more outlandish the imposture, actually, in some ways, the easier to get away with it. So pretend to be an airline pilot, pretend to be a surgeon.
He had the uniform.
Yeah, and people would, and most of us would think, well, that nobody would possibly try to pretend to be this if they weren't. So, and two things as well, Ron. I mean, I want to go back to something you said, Jonathan, that I thought was a really powerful scene where he, as you said, he speaks in the first person. And he says, well, I'm a killer. And that so goes back to what, Nicholas, you started our conversation off with, in that on the one level, you could see people in the church thinking, well, what he means is, it's like when the priest says, well, I am a sinner too. Yes, in our hearts, aren't we all killers? In our hearts, aren't we all thieves? And it turns out that he also means that literally, that no, actually, I've taken a human life. I mean, I really have taken a human life, and seeking. So he's telling the truth, but it's in a situation where, sort of like with the imposture being a priest, that people may be regarding that allegorically, because who would actually say that in the church? And then this is something, I saw another interview online with the director talking about Daniel, and that as he viewed the character, that Daniel knows once he starts, following through, on this impersonation, which starts really almost as almost a flirtation, with the young woman in the church. Say, well, I'm a priest, and then it kind of snowballs, and he gets to a point where you could see him in the movie sort of thinking, do I go with this? And as he goes with it, I think the director says, we understand that Daniel knows this cannot end well. Daniel knows that the longer he stays, that they're going to find out. And I think that comment about the motorcycle is very interesting along those lines of that. The only exit strategy would be a literal exit strategy. Mm-hmm. I get this motorcycle fixed, and then just one day I take off. Yet, even though he loses the motorcycle, he still has opportunities to leave. And he, in fact, finds himself more and more drawn in, mm-hmm. knowing, and because he's not a stupid character, he knows full well that at some point, this is going to come crashing down around him. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday as well, too, in some of the great scenes, like he has the scene with, you brought this up, Nicholas, the scene with the mayor in the car, where the mayor sort of, I'm
right.
I'm right. He said, well, there's right and there's power, and I've got the power. And then when they go out to bless the sawmill, which is also a great scene, Daniel then kind of fearlessly doesn't explicitly denounce the mayor, but has them all get down on their knees and does sort of, and there's a kind of nothing left to lose quality, because he also knows that, well, what's going to happen is if they catch me, they'll send me back to the detention center. You know, like I've been in the detention center. And the first prospect of freedom given him was working in the sawmill. And you know, I think I read that as, well, how is this different than the detention center? And it's reinforced later when his friend comes ostensibly to blackmail him in another communion sequence where they then get drunk, but but share the blood of Christ between them, and it turns into a confession sequence.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
his friend shares the same, articulates, I think, what Daniel's reaction was earlier, that, so this is going to be my life. So I'm going to be at the bottom rung of society, working in this sawmill until I'm too old to do it anymore. You know, and that's going to be my future. And how is that better than what I was coming from? What do I aspire to? And the priesthood not only offers Daniel status, but we could see this becoming involved in a really meaningful vocation where he sees a way of doing some good that I take it as something he's never experienced in his life before. That there's a chance at redemption for himself and for others. The director talked about there being two storylines in the movie that come together in the middle. One storyline is Daniel's story, his own personal story. And the other storyline is the trauma in the community, as the community is trying to work through this and work beyond this tragedy. And I think, Nicholas, you said they were kind of stuck. You know, they're stuck in this loop of mourning, and those two storylines come together in the movie.
I mean, their lives are their Groundhog Day. It's the Groundhog Day of grief. You know,
that's a great phrase.
Even down to this makeshift shrine.
I don't have
notice they visit the shrine on a daily basis. They go to worship at the shrine of the deceased than they actually do church. So you know, it's talk about a graven image if you want to invoke the commandments. But
yeah, they've created their alternate church outside of the real church. And yeah.
Sorry, not to jump in for. Tim had a comment before. I think Margaret has a comment as well.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, if I may. Going back to Ron's question earlier, the conceit or the concept of a imposter priest has been seen very, very frequently in film, mostly in Europe, but also in the States, as John has pointed out. Generally, those films are farces. And
that's right.
This one obviously isn't, which is a large distinction. And the other thing about Catholics in America and Catholics in Poland, this is one of the most popular films ever, biggest box office, all kinds of awards. And Poland, I believe, is 85 to 90% Catholic. So the film was obviously embraced there as well. That's all.
Margaret, did you?
I just had a thought to share. And one of the, first of all, again, thanks to Joseph, John, and Nicholas for just such a great discussion. But when I watched this film, as someone who grew up in the Catholic faith, the question it raised for me was, do you have to be consecrated to be a priest? Because Daniel brought that community together, and you could see, yes, it wasn't completely healed, but some of the healing and the energy of the people in the scenes in the church. And it was like, yes, I understand you may not want a convicted person to be a priest, but he was being maybe the best priest they might ever have. And it just made me wonder about that.
Well, the thing is, it's you've got two different layers going on there, Margaret. First and foremost, by virtue of the whole reality of becoming a priest is considered a sacrament in the Roman Catholicism. So it's something that is bestowed upon first and foremost by God, recognized by the church. It's not recognized by the church and then ordained by God. So I think the premier question is who at what level. You use the word consecrated. Who does the consecrating?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the community's recognition of someone that consecrates someone to the priesthood? Is it because they have gone and gotten the theological training at the seminary? Is it because they got voted in? Or is it because God Almighty chose this person for this holy vocation? And so so that's why in real life and in the movie, whether it be the other priest within the film or in real life, the Vatican, the church, the bishops are never going to recognize this, no matter what the community says.
Mm-hmm.
That's the master stroke of the screenwriter or the screenplay here is that he allows us as viewers to think that this individual could have been chosen by God because he acted in godly ways. Mm-hmm. And even though he's told repeatedly that he would never be accepted or become part of the formal church.
And then, and Tim, that brings up the other point. This I think is a huge contention, not so much with Protestants and Catholics, but with Catholics and Catholics. Mm-hmm. Who has access to God? This is all about who has access to God and mm-hmm. who speaks for God's will mm-hmm. For the individual and for the corporate gathered.
Yeah. And that's it's a powerful question throughout Christianity. I'm thinking of the tradition of the Society of the Friends, of Quakers, oh, yeah. Where that tradition is anybody who's a part of the meeting at any time could speak the Spirit of God. It doesn't matter how old you are, what your gender is, or even what you may have done in your life. If you feel moved by the Spirit of God, then for that moment, you're the quote unquote clergy. And I think the movie frames this, as you're talking about this, Margaret, consecration in a very interesting way. And I think the director does this deliberately by putting the question back on the audience. So early on in the movie, as moviegoers, we're always looking to see, well, who's the main character? Who are we supposed to sympathize with? Who are we rooting for? And early on, when we're first introduced to Daniel, we see Daniel in a very negative light. Again, taking part in the beating of one of his fellow members of the inmates in the detention center. And he seems to be taking participating fully in this. And then we move to the scenes with the priest coming to the detention center and holding mass. So it's both a totally different view of all of the young men we just saw. So first we see the young men torturing one of their own, and then we see the young men in the service within the detention center. And then we see that Daniel actually is sort of the main altar boy, that he's helping officiate with this, and has the scene with the priest afterwards. I think a very moving scene where he's saying he's actually interested in going to seminary, and the priest having to tell him that, well, because of your record, you would never be admitted. And I think you see Daniel saying, well, that seems contrary to how I'm understanding the gospel, that I thought we could all be forgiven. But as viewers, I think the movie sets up this dichotomy for us as to, well, what do we think of Daniel? So the consecration question is also our question. Like, what do we think of this character? And I know I read in other interviews about this that the director, in looking for the star of the movie, and the star, the actor playing Daniel, I think, is quite remarkable in this movie. And they needed to find somebody who could be both convincing at being a thug, that you could believe that this person could be a street hoodlum, and at the same time be convincing that this person could be an effective minister and priest. And the director said, in our auditions, actors would either be one or the other. Like they would read for the part, and boy, we really bought them as the thug, but once we saw them that way, we just couldn't see them another way. Sort of like if Joe Pesci in Goodfellas then was going to be a priest in the movie, like that just wouldn't work. Or they came off as the priest, but then you just couldn't buy them as somebody capable of inflicting violence. And that the actor they cast, and I think this is true, is incredibly effective at being able to be both menacing and comforting in different scenes. And I think that for those of us watching the movie, I think that's a really powerful emotional experience ourselves, as we're trying to figure out, what do we think about Daniel? So I could sort of throw that question back at you, Margaret, or to everybody. Do we think that Daniel is consecrated or is called by God, or has legitimacy? We know he does achieve some good, but how did folks who watched this movie kind of make sense of their own evaluation of Daniel's character? Yeah.
I think he was called by God. Margaret's vote.
Yes. Oh, am I here? Yeah, it looks like Jean has a comment.
Yeah.
Mom's
iPad, right?
Well, if he's performed as a priest, yes, he did clearly seem like he was called by God. But as soon as he got back into the detention center, he went back to being a thug. So
Yeah. How did you make sense of that?
Yeah, how do you make sense of that? Yeah. I don't think he was converted. Like, he really was genuinely a good person all the way through to the end, because in the end, he would kill that guy for God's sake,
Gene, I wonder though, I firmly agree with, it was either Tolstoy or Dostoevsky that said, if a person had to literally wear like clothing the deepest recesses of their fantasy, of their sins, of their wishes, of their desires, our eyes would never, ever, ever leave the ground due to our shame. And so, I can't couch it that neatly. I wish I could, in right or wrong. Because when he is thrown back in to the detention center, it also becomes an act of survival. And he is fighting for his life. And as I said last night, though it was a violent scene, there was so much more violence in the movie beyond him getting the hell beat out of him or him beating the hell out of somebody. In fact, to me, I said that was one of the purest scenes, because at least it was an honest fight. You had one person fighting out of grief and anger because you were the catalyst in my brother's death. And you've got the other that is fighting for his life. fighting for his freedom, fighting for some respect, fighting back. So I don't see it. It'd be one thing if it was revenge, or he was just going around and picking fights. Then I would question his moral compass. I don't know. I think it's a little tougher than that for me.
Well, it's a really interesting question because, again, there's the theological question of, like you mentioned, a good person. Certainly, if you're coming from a Calvinist perspective, the answer would be nobody's a good person. Everybody deserves to go to hell, and that people are saved through the infinite mercy of God. But people who haven't killed anybody yet, it's sort of the Dostoevsky or Tolstoy quote. It's just circumstances haven't come up yet. But
yeah,
I'm thinking of the line, Noah Cross's line from Chinatown. Under the right circumstances, people are capable of anything.
Yeah. Solzhenitsyn said the same thing in the in the gulags. He was like, the only difference between me and my guard is that he's the guard and I'm the prisoner.
Well, and that's sort of the Stanford prison experiments that Philip Zimbardo did in the 1970s, where college students were put in the roles of prison guards and prisoners, and the college students who were the guards began torturing their classmates. But at the heart of the movie, that also goes to this question of the tragedy, this car accident, which is shrouded in mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And I was saying last night, one of the things I appreciated about the movie was, on the one hand, it took advantage of the genre of the detective story. It's because we all want to know, well, what's going on? We see the shrine, and along with Daniel, we're then on sort of from Daniel's perspective, what's the shrine about? What is this all about? And he's just getting bits and pieces, and we're just getting bits and pieces about what happened. And it turns out there was this auto accident. And then there was a group of young people in the town who were in one car, and then the other car was driven by this man, and his widow is now a pariah in the town, and they all blame him. And Daniel plays detective and finds out more evidence that, the young people actually were drinking and getting high before they got into the car. And this is something that the community doesn't want to hear. And just when it seems like, now we know what really happened,
mm-hmm.
Then he finds out from the widow that, actually the other driver was also maybe drinking and was depressed, and she was worried that he was going out to kill himself. So it kind of comes down to, if we think we're going to solve this tragedy or reach closure by figuring out who was at fault, we're never going to figure out who was at fault. That everybody was kind of at fault, and which means nobody was really at fault, and it was just kind of a thing that happened. And the community is obsessed with assigning blame, and Daniel is in trying to then thread that needle of, the widow also lost a loved one, and you're denying her compassion and you're denying her grief because you feel like, but her husband was a bad man, and so is not worth mourning because he killed all these people. But the movie itself never gives us, and I think the ending is very powerful in that way, in terms of, and then Daniel was redeemed, and he went on to lead, that the kind of realism of the movie is, no, Daniel would be sent back to the detention center, and it's not as if he would come back into the detention center and say, hey, everybody, I've got the good news, and reform all the inmates. The first priest, who is sort of in some ways, I think, of the official priest, he's sort of the good priest, the priest in the prison, is getting through, is kind of having some success with the young men. He tells Daniel he can't go to seminary, but that's not his decision. It's not like the priest is not saying, I won't let you. He's just saying, hey, these are the rules. They're not going to accept you, and I'm sorry about that. And but Daniel will be thrust back into this environment where there's other prisoner who wants to kill him, and his whole life he's a survivor. He's grown up without any family to speak of, without a sense of community other than the only friends he's had are the other boys he's in the detention center with, and they're not really his friends. As you see, it's not until he gets to the community that he actually has some deep, intimate relationships with people and becomes vulnerable.
Sorry, not to. We have a couple things, a couple questions.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Ron, did you have something from before that you wanted to jump in with?
Yeah, it was way before. It was
a while.
No, go ahead.
I might be out of context a little bit, but when Margaret's question was hit right on one of the things I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And I guess I could summarize real quickly after listening to you all. Whether it's Daniel or Leonardo DiCaprio, the imitation of whatever kind of a person they're looking at. As long as people believe, then that person is who they say they are.
Yeah.
It's when people stop believing that the question comes up is did he really have the power to change the Eucharist? Did Leo DiCaprio really have the license to fly a plane? Did he really have the license to be a doctor? And it's such that, did that really matter as long as you believe?
Yeah.
It's only when the believing stops does that question get asked.
That's where I think the thing that we don't get to see on the other side of the movie is the collateral damage left in the wake.
Exactly.
We see the collateral damage of his life returning to the juvenile detention center. We get just a glimpse of the widow returning to church, which to me I'm going to be honest, I did not like that. I thought it was way too pretty. I wish that they had drilled down more on the daughter departing town, almost like the prodigal, because that was the only piece of the movie, in my opinion, that shifted in the slightest of ways responsibility not to the drivers but to God. That was the only possibility of God being put on trial, which we never see. There's a very powerful play called God on Trial, written by Elie Wiesel, which is worth the watch. And there's no they touch on a theology of protest, but I don't think they dig down deep enough into it. So that would have been an interesting storyline, or a portion of it, if you will. But you can't do everything.
It also looked like Tim had a comment or a question.
Actually, Nicholas pretty much just covered it for me.
Okay.
And I was just going to add really quickly to what you were saying, Ron, about people believing in it. It's so true what you were saying, and I think it also extends to ourselves, because we've all heard, it's become a cliche now, the idea of imposter syndrome. That even if you have, say, certification, like say you have a PhD or you have a medical license, still feeling ourselves at times that hey, I'm just faking this, that everybody else seems to know what they're doing, but I'm just dancing as hard as I can here. And there was some sort of mix up that they passed me in these exams or they certified me. But the certification, it's sort of like when you become 18 or 21, it's not as if you wake up the next day and say, oh, now I'm an adult. Now it all makes sense. or I think, finally, when our daughter was born and we left the hospital, both my wife and I were sort of astounded that we went out to the car, they made sure our daughter was in the little carrier, and they just let us drive away with her, and wanting to say, we took some classes and you came in and showed us a few things, but you're just going to let us take this baby? We have no idea what we're doing. We're now seen as the parents, and it'll all just come naturally. And so I think it's a very human quality as well, too, of that, which may speak to the real parish priests' own sort of crisis, that he is officially sanctioned by the church. But I think as we see his sort of self-destructive behavior, that this is like an outward manifestation of his own doubts about whether he's really up to the task, and whether he really is called, or whether he has gotten in way over his head himself.
John, he's fallen into the trap of acquiescence.
Mm-hmm.
He's given
Sure.
he's given into the other powers that be, which was
Sure.
the same thing that afflicted Daniel originally, when we saw him in the fight scene early on.
Mm-hmm.
When he abandoned that acquiescence and started to stand for the things that he believed, maybe that was the moment that he became godly.
Yeah.
I don't think it's like flipping a switch. I think it's a gradual process.
Oh, and that's such a human reaction too, when you talk about acquiescence. I mean, isn't that what we all do at times, and to a certain extent of we go along with what the job calls for, or what we want to be accepted, we want to maintain our status, and it's very hard to rock the boat. And especially in a small community like that, where rocking the boat means, well, you see what can happen to somebody. They can be ostracized, and the priest has a comfortable life, but you could see it's eating at him, at that acquiescence, that he knows on some level that he's not fulfilling a pastoral duty, at least in the way that he feels he should be fulfilling a pastoral duty, even if the people around him in the community aren't complaining. But certainly the mayor thinks he's the actual priest is doing fine.
I think in one way that I think the priest answers to the mayor. I think that is to be assumed.
Oh yeah.
The mayor holds the power in the town. But it's funny that you mentioned this is almost you've got two parallel, almost opposite existential crises that erupts here. You've got Daniel, who has done the bad things, now is leading a life of good. Then you've got the priest, who can represent many a clergy who are faking it themselves.
Yeah.
Fake it till you make it. They feel like they're used car salesmen. They're selling a product they don't use, and the product is faith.
Yeah. And they don't know if they believe in it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, how many clergy do I know that have all but given up on spirituality, faith, and organized religion themselves, by virtue of a plethora of realities, which we don't need to go into.
Oh yeah, it's a literary trope and a movie trope, and for those of us who are teachers, you see there's a lot of similarities in those callings, and we've all seen the teachers who become burnt out and have sort of lost their faith in the purpose of being a teacher, sort of perhaps beaten down by just the reality of the difficulties of the job and all of the bureaucracy and the thanklessness of it, and versus folks who still maintain that core spirit of I know why I'm doing this and why I think this is important. But yeah, it's hard, and just like I don't think it's flipping off a switch. It's also something that comes and goes in everyone's life. It's it's also like a day-to-day thing. And boy, you know, in quarantine, I think everybody has been going on psychological and spiritual roller coasters, maybe from 1 hour to the next of, hey, I think I've got this, to I just want to sit in a dark room all day, or we're going to get through this, to it's never going to end. And what am I doing? We're in the middle of this giant existential crisis, I think, in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we've heard people commenting, and I think this is probably true, that as we transition to whatever the after times are, you may see a whole group of people who begin to refashion their lives, you know, and maybe move into some new directions after going through this period of forced taking stock and forced reexamination of, what am I doing with my life and where am I going with my life? And that's kind of at the heart of, to go back to appearances where we start, how many of the people in the village, you mentioned it's like the Groundhog's Day of grieving, and it's also the Groundhog's Day of just day-to-day life, of everybody just does the same thing every day. And speaking of power, I just have to throw this, one of my favorite scenes in the movie is going past the mayor's house where you see him washing his car, and this figure of power, and I think this is there's an intentionally intentional humor on the part of the director. You see this mighty man in town. I mean, his house is big compared to other people in the town, but it's not really a giant house, and he's out washing his car himself. So he's like this much above everybody else, but compared to, say, the movers and shakers in Warsaw, you know, he himself is a provincial, and
He's still a small town mayor.
he's a small town mayor. And I think Joseph, you brought this up, the scene where he's bringing people together in to try and work out a compromise. He also has insecurity about his own hold on power. He is the mayor, after all, and even though he seems pretty secure in his position, it could all go away at any moment if something happens or the political winds turn. And you could see his investment in not wanting to rock the boat in terms of this cycle of grief everybody is in, because that could mean the end of his position as mayor of the small town.
I also, you talk about the shot of him washing his car. I thought it was humorous that his house was gated.
Yes.
And it was the only house that's gated.
It's gated, but from the gate to the front door is like 35 feet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the smallest estate you can imagine.
Yeah. Karen has a question, and also Anna, she had to go, but we had a question from her too, but we'll go with Karen first.
Okay, thanks. I find myself wondering what it would be like to be a Polish person watching this film, because I feel like there's so much history there.
Yeah.
You know, there's probably such a powerful strand of cynicism. I mean, Poland was a very class-based society until the communist era, and then they had the Holocaust, and then they had communist rule, and lots of power structures in place that would make the individual feel that they were pretty much stuck in the position they were born to.
And a very cynical view of history too. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could see the kids in the movie hanging out together, all of them sharing the lie about the accident. I assume they knew that, you know, their friends had been drinking, and you know, sort of just living in a somewhat a life where they were sort of trapped. And maybe the priest didn't have the original priest didn't have the greatest amount of respect for his, or hope for his charges, because he knew of the corruption, and, you know, so I'm just trying to imagine how, I guess somebody said earlier that this was a huge popular hit in Poland, that, you know, maybe this sense of some kind of fresh possibility with this young man, I could sort of imagine how it might have been very appealing.
I think it was more of a slice of life there
Okay.
than
That too.
might have assumed if it had taken place here.
I'm sorry.
I think it was more of a slice of life for the Poles than it would have been for the Americans
Yes.
if,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
it was set in the States.
Yeah, but Karen, I think your point is really well taken. That I mean, that's always one of the fun things about Cincinnati World Cinema and watching international cinema, that where you get to see movies from different cultural contexts, and of course we read it through our own cultural lens, but it's partly an insight into another cultural perspective. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, in terms of not just, but if we just looked at 20th, 21st century history in Poland, it's not a happy history, and it's not a history that would be conducive to, say, a more kind of American optimism and can-do, and things are just going to get better and better, and that may be speaking also to that ending of the movie, that not ending on a kind of openly redemptive note, but with the young woman leaving town and Daniel being sent back to the detention center. And it's almost as if the movie is presenting these epiphanies as exactly that, like moments in time, not a state that you live in forever, but that these flashes of insight that occur, these moments of a flash of understanding of what's meant by love in a deep sense, but they don't last. I mean, then life comes back in, and so I think I think your point is very, very well taken. I do think, thinking about the Polish context of this and how this would be received by Polish audiences, and the director himself also talked about you mentioned the class stratification. He put that in the context of as a director, he comes from Warsaw and is part of the intellectual elite hipster class, art filmmakers, and he's setting the movie in rural Poland, and that there's a little bit of he said the same sort of like red state, blue state dimension to this, that what religion means and what culture means, and how these two groups look at each other very warily, like distrust of the rural folks for the city folks and vice versa, and wanting to make a movie to kind of bridge that gap as well too.
Yeah, this movie could have never been made in Warsaw.
Right. Although that's one of the kind of classic imposter scenes early on, which is almost like Catch Me If You Can, when the parish priest in the town is asking Daniel, where'd you go to seminary? And it's one of those moments of he gives him some choices, and I'm just gonna flip a coin here, and I hope it's not the one you went to.
So Anna's question was for Nicholas, and it's we kind of talked about it early on, but wondering if we could kind of go into it a little further about Daniel's effectiveness as a priest and his sermons and his confessions. From a traditional institutional perspective, they're pretty unorthodox. So the question is, if you remove the endpoint aside, that the church was ultimately going to come in and he was like, what he was doing was unsustainable, say that that he would have been able to continue to do that. Do you think the community would have continued to have accepted him, or do you think his unorthodox methods would have had side effects as they went on, as they continued?
A few things. One, I can only speak very limited based on the fact that I am not an ordained Catholic priest. I'm an ordained Protestant Presbyterian minister. So that's going to be a limitation. But be that as it may, I did not see him as quote unquote unorthodox. That would be one thing to note. I think going back to one of John's point, I would love to, again, I would love to see how a young priest in Warsaw is as compared to an older, obviously older, very, very, very traditional liturgical priest in a very rural setting. This obviously is not a town that is on a major trade route or highway.
Right.
So I doubt that they didn't even seem to have a town pub. So would the town have put up with it? I think they would have, because though he was maybe shaking things up, they did not see what he was doing as blasphemous.
Right.
And
he was trying to be orthodox.
Yeah, he was trying to stick to the rules, at least the best way he knew how. And I think that the biggest guarantor of blasphemy, non-blasphemy, would have been the mother whose son passed away, who was very, very, very devout. Obviously, I'm not going to say in her faith, but devout in her practice as a Catholic. I think that I think she would have pulled him aside, because frankly, I am convinced that she knew very early on that he was a fraud.
Yeah.
And she was willing to put up with it enough until the real priest got back.
Yeah.
But she wasn't going to let him. She was going to let him out on a very, very, very loose, not a very, very tight leash when it comes to have you crossed a line or not.
And that's a really interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because it makes me think, when I said that I don't think Daniel is trying to be unorthodox, I think maybe this is a point of connection as well with Daniel and the mother of both the dead son and her iconoclastic daughter. In that one, I think Daniel is attracted to the ritual, the sense of meaning and order that comes from following the liturgy, and that Nicholas, when you said devout in her practice, that there's something comforting and sustaining in going through in ritual itself.
Well, remember, Daniel prays the rosary.
Yes, he does, and the question of to go to a very different religious tradition, but maybe not so different, because meditation is a part of many religious traditions. But the idea of, say, of a Zen meditation tradition, which goes to are you doing it right? And in Zen meditation, often the instruction is don't seek enlightenment, like just do the work. And it's like to sit and do the work, and the discipline of doing the work is the enlightenment. And I think she maybe also recognized in him that the fact, if she did know that he was going to be an imposter, it was really faking it. In some ways, that was almost a guarantee that he wasn't going to be blasphemous, because he was really, really worried that if he strayed from doing things in the wrong order or skipping something, that he was going to be called on it. He was going to be called on it. And an interesting thing as well, too, when you mentioned about what a young priest would do in an urban congregation, say in Warsaw, that's also one of the ways the movie operates, is that as viewers of the movie, we also become members of the parish, because we see the members of the church listening to his sermons, but we're also listening to his sermons. So we're brought into the community, and we're brought into the church. And again, we're being asked to go back to Margaret's consecration question. to think about how his sermons are affecting us. Not just do we think they're orthodox in terms of Catholicism, or not only do the members of the congregation seem to be buying it, or how is it affecting members of the congregation, but I think it's also about how it's affecting us.
Well, this is the central theme, if you have not seen it, in the movie The Two Popes on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And this is it's not about orthodox, unorthodox. It's about ritual, non-ritual,
Mm-hmm.
or traditional, non-traditional. Maybe that's better terminology. It's interesting. I'm trying to think of what theologian said it, but he said the difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. The living faith of the dead. That tradition is a dynamic reality. It's that which lives on in the next generation. It's a legacy, if you will. But traditionalism is the dead faith of the living.
Mm-hmm.
Pelikan, Yaroslav Pelikan said that. And so I don't think we're dealing with orthodoxy, unorthodoxy. I think we're dealing with tradition and traditionalism.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I think it's the same thing that we see with Benedict to
Francis.
To Francis.
Yeah.
I mean, Benedict, this just, it comes across as a very staunch German grounded Catholic theologian, and then we get Francis, and Francis is he's a security nightmare. This is a guy sneaking out of the Vatican in the middle of the night to pray with the homeless of Rome. When I was in Italy, I've got a paper where he was saying that the church, the Catholic Church, is addicted to particular subjects of birth control and homosexuality, where we should be feeding people. And I love this quote. He goes, "We need to be ushering in the new fragrance of the gospel."
Mm-hmm.
So this is definitively not language of Ratzinger.
Right.
Well, Nicholas, to talk about what the Pope was doing was basically doing good, as opposed to doing things that would be restrictive or judgmental. Mm-hmm. And I see that as the core of this film. It's not tradition.
That to me is why everyone loves. That's why I think people fall in love with Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Because he can connect.
Yes.
He can empathize. He understands. He takes the time to be sincere. And his sincerity indicates that he is indeed caring. And you don't have to have a collar, okay, to have those attributes.
Well, again, the very last line of I have mentioned a couple of times that to me this is a modern day Les Miserables. This is a story of Jean Valjean. And again, the famous quote of to love another person is to see the face of God, is so apropos, in my opinion, for Daniel's actions.
Well, I think we should start wrapping it up here in a couple minutes, unless anybody else had questions. Any other questions, comments, thoughts from the Jonathan? It looks like we lost your visual. We might not.
Has this been a worthwhile experience for you all?
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank everyone for coming.
Thank you.
This is such a fun movie to talk about, and such a thought-provoking movie.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Let me do a quick closing announcement. In addition to thanking John and Nicholas and Joseph for putting this together, and it's greatly appreciated. Do want you to know that we have just sent out some information that we have a couple of new films that will be streaming. One of his is a film from Chile that's in Spanish and German that deals with the impact of a evangelical preacher who comes to Chile from Germany. And it's an animation piece.
Yeah.
And it's dark, it's devastating, but it's also truly amazing visually. And on the other side of the coin,
Oh, and give the title.
that's called the Wolf House,
Yeah.
La Casa Lobo.
It's been generating a lot of buzz around the world.
Yeah.
And that's on the website. It's in the emails that went out to all of you. And the other property that's now available are the new French films, the French shorts by mostly young French filmmakers. And it's a couple hours worth of shorts. And there's a lot in there to enjoy. And if you don't like it, you wait 5 minutes. And,
right. That's a good thing about shorts. Right.
I'm sure we'll be talking about the Wolf House for sure. Yeah.
Definitely.
But, just really appreciate seeing you all here.
Thank you.
And thank you, Joseph. Thank you for pulling this together.
Yeah, our next, as of now, our next post-film discussion will be around Slay the Dragon. We're scheduling that right now for June 11th. So definitely check back.
The documentary about redistricting, and
should be.
I think it'll be really interesting to talk about now, especially that the issues in that movie have just taken on all sorts of new resonance in the current situation.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.